My name is Beth Dinelli. I'm the director of Commonwealth Learning Center in Needham. So tonight is the last webinar in our series of Discuss and Discover presentations for the school year. So a little bit of information about Commonwealth Learning Center. So Commonwealth Learning Center is a nonprofit agency that specializes in providing one-to-one instruction for students with learning differences, such as dyslexia, ADHD, and executive functioning. And our teachers use research-based methodologies and programs to teach students reading, writing, and math. And teachers really customize lessons to meet the individual needs of our students. And Commonwealth Learning Center also strives to reach our mission, which is to be an educational resource to the community. And be on the lookout in the fall for dates for our Discuss and Discover webinars for next school year. So tonight's webinar is called IEPs, 504s, DCAPs, Oh My, and our presenter is Kat Marsh. So Kat is the lead full-time teacher at Commonwealth Learning Center in Needham. She's been with Commonwealth Learning Center for 18 years and has worked with students of all grade levels. In 2022, she received her doctorate degree in education from Lesley University, which completed a career change that started with homeschooling her own children who have learning differences. She's worked as a teacher and tutor for over 25 years in many learning environments, and Kat enjoys adapting teaching strategies to fulfill diverse student needs. So it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Kat Marsh.
Thanks, Beth, for that introduction. Apologies for the dogs barking in the background. There's people coming and going, I guess. And thanks also to Stacy, kind of behind the scenes. She'll be monitoring the chat box and fielding questions for us at the end of the session, or pop in anytime if you have a question. Okay, let me share my screen here and we'll find our... Okay, we are going to dive in to IEPs and 504s and DCAPs, and you might not even know what DCAPs is, but we will cover that. If you are new to this, my goal is kind of give you an overview of these things, these educational supports that are out there and how you can access them potentially. If you're more of an old hand, maybe you'll find an aha moment or a little tip or something that can help you carry on. So basically, we're going to cover where did these things come from? And I'm going to cover that a bit because I think it's important that you know where they came from, because their background, how they came about, has had a long-term, I'm going to say cultural influence on the school districts that use them. So for example, some school districts view them in one way and they're more restrictive about it, and others are more open and so forth. So if you know a little bit about where each of these things come from, then you'll know, you might understand why some school districts approach them certain ways compared with others. We're also going to cover, you know, who are they for? Who are they supposed to be for? And who do they end up being for? A lot about how you get one. What are the parts? What are the process? And how do you get them implemented? And at the end, I have a couple of resources for us to take a look at. Okay, so I wanted to mention right away, first of all, that IEPs in Massachusetts are now new and improved. They have changed recently, and all school districts should now be using the new and improved version. There are forms to support the IEP development, and you can find them pretty easily. I have a link here at the bottom here, the Department of Education in Massachusetts, but you can just put in your search engine new IEPs in Massachusetts, and it will lead you to the forms. And I wanted to mention that some of the forms are used only by the school district, but you as parents and teachers and administrators can look at them and download them and ask questions about them. There's some like, charts and guidelines for schools. So sometimes as a parent, it's handy to have that knowledge. Okay, so let's start with some background on these educational supports. Starting with the origin of 504s, because chronologically they came first. Here we have President Nixon signing the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, which has a section 504. It also has a section 501, 502, 503, but 504 has to do with persons with disabilities. This is a civil rights law. It was designed to protect persons with disabilities in areas and programs that use federal dollars. So it's really a pretty broad thing. It applies, from preschool, grade school, high school, workplaces, public accessibility, and so forth. It's not really, wasn't really designed exactly for students in schools, although it covers them, or it should. The focus is on everyday tasks. So walking, seeing, hearing, speaking, yes, learning, but also working and doing daily self-care. Unfortunately, this act says nothing about how schools should proceed or what schools should do. It does not require schools to meet with parents. So I like to point that out because sometimes school districts feel a little funny about 504s for that reason. But again, that's that cultural background that it has. The benefit of 504s is if you have one, it still applies after graduation from high school, which the IEP does not. Okay, a little more background. So 504s with teeth. From the passage of Section 504 and its other sections in 1973 till 1977, there were no published regulations to support people with disabilities. And I mean this pretty broadly. There was no regulations, for example, for apartment buildings to have access for wheelchairs or anything like that. And so disability advocates got together and they organized the 504 sit-in of 1977, where they occupied federal buildings to demand an enforcement of Section 504 regulations. This photo here is from Boston, one of the Boston federal buildings. I mean, it's called a sit-in, but it doesn't look like there's too many people sitting around. But anyway, it worked. And we did get some regulations in place. I also want to point out that 504 is different from special education. It doesn't require specialized instruction, just accommodations to access the learning environment. Okay, a little bit more background. Before 1975, there were no formal legal protections for children with disabilities to receive a free public education. Many children with disabilities were institutionalized, didn't attend school, or struggled without the individualized programs that they need. When I was a child, we had a park nearby where I lived, and there was a little Down syndrome boy there. He was a couple of years younger than me, but everyone in the neighborhood played with him. My brothers and sister played with him, my friends in the neighborhood. He was just another kid. And one day, innocently, we were starting school in the following week, and I asked his mother, "Oh, what school is he going to go to?" And she said, "Oh, Joey can't go to school." And I said, "What? Why not?" And she said, "Well, they won't take him. They won't take him in school." This was late 1960s. And I was shocked. I was, what do you mean they won't take him? Every kid goes to school, and he seemed perfectly fine to me. But being the innocent and naive child I was, I did not realize what was happening. Okay, so along comes now the origin of IEPs. So this was happening around 1975, where there was an act called the Education for All Handicapped Children Act. This was the one that specifically addresses students with disabilities and their right to receive a free and appropriate education. You may have heard that FAPE, free and appropriate education. In 1990, the name was changed to the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA, which is what you'll mostly hear it referred to today. There's been a few more changes over the years. to, hone the regulations and ensure equal access to education. But this is specifically for, well, we used to use the word handicap. That's not a word to use anymore, but back then it was culturally appropriate. So this act was focused on education, qualifying disabled children receiving special education and service for learning, applies to preschool through high school, generally ages 3 to 21. The federal government provides money to state and local governments for this type of education, although it varies from state to state. Massachusetts probably receives around 7 or 8% of the money that we need. The rest comes from the state and local towns. Other districts, like, for example, Detroit, I think, receives almost 50% of its education money from the federal government. Any case, this act does require schools to meet with parents to develop the IEP. However, it does not apply after high school graduation. So just to give you some kind of, we've been talking about accommodations and modifications, and the differences between the 504 and the IEP is really boils down to these two words. So I want to make sure you understand, an accommodation is something that levels the playing field so that students can fully participate in educational activities. Whereas an IEP actually changes what's being taught to match the student's abilities, and it's based on learning goals. Okay, so specific goals are written for that particular student. So to give you a sort of like basic example, an accommodation would be similar to cutting the curb at the sidewalk so that someone with a wheelchair can get up and down onto the sidewalk or cross the street safely. Whereas a modification would be if someone needed to learn how to cross the street safely and they needed specialized education to do that, then we would make a specific goal for that and benchmark so that the person could learn to come up to the street, look both ways, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so hopefully you're seeing the difference there between accommodations and modifications. I'm going to talk more about that. So if it's still confusing, just hold on. So educators for accommodations present information in different ways. Students can demonstrate in different ways. For IEP, the curriculum is adapted to focus on content. Sometimes content is simplified or tasks are reduced. Examples of accommodation could be extra time or assistive technology, visual prompts and instructions, copies of notes, things like that. IEP modifications, the student might get alternative assignments, they might get explicit type of instruction, they might get modified materials and things like that. Okay, let's carry on. Let's see. Okay, now a word about district curriculum accommodation plans, DCAPs. These are fairly new. They were adopted in 2006, which was a while ago, but fairly new is slow in education. You should be able to find whatever district you're in. You should be able to search for your town's DCAP. Every town, I'm pretty sure every town has one. There was a deadline, and I think now every town has one. But also every town is and every district can be slightly different. So they're not all identical. It's not like Massachusetts wrote it and told every town they had to adopt it. This is a general Massachusetts general law. The idea behind this was to sort of assist the regular classroom teacher in accommodating different learning styles in the regular classroom. So not special education at all. Addressing kids who might have, some kind of a special need, but who don't qualify for a special education services. The idea is that we want to make every effort we can to make sure that we're meeting those students' needs in the regular classroom and avoiding unnecessary referrals to special education. Because as you'll see in a minute, the process of going through the evaluation and all that for IEPs is quite extensive. So we wanted to kind of give teachers a way to offer accommodations to students without having to do anything. No need for a 504, no need for an IEP, no need for referrals, no need for special educators to jump in. Plus, I've noticed over the years, over the several decades that I've been familiar with public schools and working with kids in schools, sometimes teachers are hesitant to offer something because they say, well, if I give him a copy of the notes, then I have to give everybody a copy of the notes. And then maybe the principal will end up getting mad at them and so forth. And, what are you doing and so forth. So this was a really more nicely formal way to make sure that teachers had a whole list of things that they could offer without having to consult anyone. And they were pretty happy about that. So we'll talk about the pros and cons here. So actually, yeah, let's start in with that. Let's talk about the pros and cons of DCAPs. So how do you get one? Well, just ask. It's as easy as that. You simply have to mention something to your child's teacher or principal or any professional at the school. What can you get for DCAP instructional supports? This is some that I pulled out of the one that's currently in force at Needham. Queuing and wait time to encourage participation, multimodal presentation and instruction, reteaching, breaking down steps, actual instructions for students in study skills and note-taking, study guides, extended time for tests, okay? So teachers in Needham can offer these to students without having to do anything. They don't have to consult with anyone or ask a special education teacher or ask permission from the principal or anything like that. So the thing is, though, what if I can't get one? What if I ask and nobody does anything? What if I ask for extended time but nothing happens and so forth? And we know this happens a lot. Is a DCAP guaranteed? Well, it is a Massachusetts law, but unless you're prepared to take someone to court, I guess the realistic answer is no, not really. It really is there to give teachers ideas about what they can offer. If there's a problem getting it, I would suggest, get a copy of it. Print a copy of your district's DCAP and highlight the thing that you're looking for and present that. Teachers are busy and overwhelmed and so forth, and maybe they just didn't realize that that item was in there. I'm sure they've been asked to read it at some point, but many of them are any number of 20 and 30 pages long, so the teacher may not have noticed that. And that's probably what I would recommend if it's a good starting place. Let's put it that way. Okay. All right. So let's go on to 504s. Now, how do we get started? Okay. So this is how 504s happen. When a student is having some academic or social behavioral problem that limits life activities, walking, seeing, hearing, speaking, and learning, and the district believes the student needs additional support in the regular classroom, then you can sort of start the conversation about a 504. Parents can make a written request. Sometimes the school makes a request, teachers make a request. Parental consent is needed. They can't just simply write a 504 for your child without your permission and consent. However, the student must attend a school that receives federal funds. Remember that the 504 came about because the federal government signed the legislation and said, if you use federal funds, you have to follow the 504. Student has to be of school age, age 3 to 21. They have to have a mental, psychological, or physical disability that limits one or more life activities. Okay, so the 504 really has to be based on some kind of formal evaluation. Okay. Let's see, what else do we want to say about this? Oh, yes. Who determines eligibility? Oh, and the that image of student handbook is reminding me, oftentimes in your child's student handbook, and this applies to elementary as well as high school, oftentimes the 504 information is in that student handbook. So if you haven't noticed it before, that might be a good resource. Okay, so for a 504, the district is responsible for carrying out any evaluations at no cost to the parents. And the parents, of course, consent to any evaluations, and they can happen every 3 years. They do happen every 3 years. The oversight is the responsibility of the school principal. Districts typically appoint a coordinator, but if you're in a very small district, there might not be a person with that title, supposedly, but you can always start with the principal. The eligibility is made by a group of people, including those who know the child, who can provide meaning to the evaluations, and who can provide information about accommodations. Now, I'm pointing this out. It is not required for the parents to be part of the team. However, any school district worth its salt is going to include you in the process because, well, problems happen if they don't. Okay. Now, what can we get from a 504? I like this website. If you're looking at this image at the bottom, there's a link, adayinourshoes.com. There's a ton of information in there about types of accommodations. So if you're considering some kind of 504 accommodation or even IEP accommodation, and you just don't know what to call it or how to word it or something like that, that's a good resource. So some of the things you can get from a 504: extra time for homework, an extra set of books for home, preferential seating, assistance when moving about the building, grading based on individual progress or effort, test retakes, etc. And way at the bottom, I have behavior intervention plans. Yes, those things can be included in an IEP. Access to a counselor can be included in an IEP. I mean, in a 504, sorry, we didn't get to IEPs yet. So there are a lot of things that can be put in 504 without going into formally writing an IEP. And that is definitely worth considering. What else do you want to consider? Okay, so for 504s, the goal, remember, the goal of 504s is to remove a barrier to learning. Remember, cutting the curb so the person can get up onto the sidewalk. So you ask yourself, what is the barrier to learning? I'll give you a couple of examples. Suppose a dyslexic student reads slowly and needs a way to read material more quickly. They could use a text-to-speech. Okay. I don't want color. I want to. Okay. Another example is, suppose an ADHD student loses homework and handouts. A 504 can specify that they will be taught and teachers will monitor organization plan for materials. A student with generalized anxiety may get overwhelmed. They need a quiet space to regroup and or access to a counselor. So these are the types of things that can be put in a 504. Again, the 504, the basis of the 504 is for that free and appropriate public education. It should be the least restrictive environment. With a 504, they are not pulling your child out of class and putting them in a special math class or something like that. You also have discipline rights regarding school suspensions and things like that with a 504. There are procedural safeguards for families. Families have to be notified what's happening. They have the right to examine documents. You have a right to an impartial hearing or mediation, a review or appeal if you don't feel the 504 is well written or isn't being carried out appropriately. And as a bonus, the 504s carry over into college. Now, sometimes kids who have been on an IEP will transition to a 504 during high school so that they can carry that over into college. but it's not a kind of a, just take the 504 and hand it to the college. You have to kind of self-identify to the college. You have to provide the documentation, the evaluation that you had for the disability, and you have to work with the disability services coordinator on campus to receive accommodation. So it's not an actual guarantee. You don't just submit the 504 and call it good. But it does tend to carry over, and in fact, it carries over into the workplace. Um, okay, so what if you can't get it? Well, here's a link to the U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, and there's that address right there in Boston. They have a form you can fill out if you have an issue or a complaint, and they would be happy to help you with that. I want to point out again here before we leave off talking about 504. 504s are civil rights. Okay. Um, I, in my experience, I have known school districts inadvertently or out of ignorance writing 504s that violate a person's civil rights, like saying that they can't go to the nurse until they do something else or something like that. That's a violation of civil rights under IDEA. But I'm not saying school districts do this with malice aforethought. I'm saying we're getting back to that cultural problem that existed way back in the 1970s that still carries through in many school districts. And so you need to be aware of that as parents, teachers, administrators, that cultural bias is still there, and it still sometimes rears its ugly head. And so don't be surprised with it, but just work with it and talk about it and bring it up. Okay, now let's get on to IEPs. I'll pause for just a second in case we have any burning questions that need to come forward before we carry on here. All right, I am not hearing anything. We will still have time for questions at the end for folks. Okay, so IEPs, how do you get one? So under the IEP legislation, there's something called child find. This puts the responsibility on the state and the school district to identify, locate, and evaluate all children with disabilities in the state who may need special education and related services. So school districts do their best to kind of reach out. They reach out to pediatricians, they do public service announcements, they reach out to parents of young children, and they reach out to daycare centers, all kinds of things, asking, are there any children who may be in need of evaluation and so forth. So a school district may come to you, the parent, and say, can we evaluate your child? Parents can also call the public school district, and this means parents of very young children. So if your 2-year-old or 3-year-old appears to be struggling in some way, certainly don't hesitate to call the school district, because early intervention can really help. Or school professionals. Sometimes the teachers are recognizing, or a kindergarten teacher or preschool teacher is recognizing something that may need evaluation. Okay, so parents can contact the child's teacher. The request can be made verbally or in writing. When you make that request, it really helps if you're very specific. Please share everything your child is struggling with. Obviously, if your child is struggling to read or calculate or something, that probably is a little more obvious. But oftentimes kids are struggling, to remember things, to follow directions. They might lose things. Their emotions might be overblown at times. Maybe they struggle to listen and things like that. Please do include that when you contact the teachers, or when you, at any point actually, when you're talking about IEPs, because depending on what you say your child is struggling with, there will be a different sort of battery of tests done. And let me tell you, the number of tests that they can do, would cover pages and pages. If I just listed the title of the test, there could be pages and pages and pages of tests potentially could be done to evaluate what your child is struggling with. So the more specific you are, the easier it is for the school evaluator to choose what tests will be appropriate to help uncover what the underlying basis for things is. So please be specific. You might think, oh, that's not important. But no matter how small, it probably is important. And of course, parental consent is needed. The evaluation has to be completed within 45 school working days. So that doesn't include weekends and holidays and so forth. But it's a pretty fast turnaround. Okay, now who determines eligibility? So the child is evaluated. In other words, the child goes in and is tested typically by a psychologist or other professional, and those battery of tests happen. And then a group of qualified professionals and the parents look at those results, and together they decide if the child is a, quote, child with a disability as defined by IDEA. Now I want to show you, okay, this is the actual flow chart that is used when determining that eligibility. And you can find this flow chart if you put in your search engine, Massachusetts IEP documents or forms or something, you can find this very thing. So obviously the first step is, does the student have one or more than one disability? And there's a list there. Autism, intellectual disability, deafness, neurological, emotional, specific learning disability. That's typically something in like dyslexia or a math disability, a writing disability, something like that. And again, it's based on those evaluations that were done. So if you don't say anything about how hard it is for your child to write with a pencil, they won't do that evaluation, or they may end up not doing it. So please be specific. Okay, so even if they have a disability, the next question is, yes, but are they making progress in the regular classroom? If the answer is yes, they are making progress. They could have a developmental delay, but they're making progress. They could have a communication delay, but they're making progress. Then they're not eligible for special education. But if they're not making effective progress, then we go down to the next question. Is that lack of progress a result of the student's disability? If it's not, then again, they're not eligible. But if it is, which it typically is when you write an IEP, then you write the IEP. Okay, so it's important that you understand that it's just not like we'll have the evaluation and the evaluation says that this is the disability, therefore we'll make an IEP. We don't always do that. Okay. Now, of course, the question in many people's minds is often, what if they're not eligible? What do I do? So if you disagree with this evaluation results, you have to have your evaluated by a professional not employed by the school system. Both federal and state law allows parents to seek an independent educational evaluation. Many parents pay for this out of pocket, and it is expensive, thousands of dollars, somewhere between $3,000 and $5,000 or more. You can pay out of pocket, which many parents do, and share, or you can share your financial information with the school district and pay, apply for a sliding scale fee. It is possible, depending on your circumstances, that the school will pay the entire cost. You can always also request a mediation. You can file a complaint with the state education agency or request a due process hearing. There's a lot of fail-safes here, so don't feel that you are alone and have no place to go. All right, let's proceed as if we are going to meet and write this IEP. So the school system schedules and conducts the IEP meeting. The staff has to contact the participants, notify the parents, find a meeting time and place, tell the parents the purpose, time, and location of the meeting, tell the parents who will potentially be attending the meeting, and tell the parents that they can invite people to the meeting who have knowledge or special expertise about the child. That doesn't mean you have to hire someone. You can bring, another relative. You can bring your best friend or whatever you need to help you get through that. Okay, so meeting to write the IEP. So this is how it looks. Everybody gathers together, talk about the child's needs, what they're struggling with. And I say potentially write the IEP because they do have to go through that flow chart. That's the first thing they'll do. Well, actually, the first thing they'll do is share the evaluations, then they'll go through the flow chart. But so the evaluations are presented typically by the people who did the evaluations. Parents and staff had a chance to ask questions about the evaluations. In my experience, the majority of the time, the people who do the evaluations are very good at explaining things in simplified terms about what the evaluations mean. Also, oftentimes the school will draft the IEP during the meeting. So it's wise, if you're going to attend the meeting as a parent or a teacher, to be familiar with the format of the IEP so that you can make the most useful and efficient contributions as they're writing things. And of course, you as a parent have to accept the IEP after it's written, because the school cannot start to provide services until they have your signature on the IEP accepting it. Sometimes the school needs a few days to write the final wording or something like that. And do be very careful. I've been in IEP meetings where what was being said was not translated exactly in the wording that the person was typing, or someone else took that and wrote it the way they typically write it, which was not what was said in the meeting. And again, I'm not saying someone did this with malice aforethought, it's just an error. But when you get the IEP copy, do read it carefully and make sure that the wording of the goals and so forth are written exactly as was discussed, because it sometimes happens that they're not. If parents don't agree with the IEP, you can reject all or part of the IEP and request to meet again to discuss. Again, the next step, now you've accepted it, it's written and it's signed, and now they're going to implement it. The teachers and other service providers have access to the IEP, and they each know their specific responsibility. The reality of that is sometimes it takes time for teachers to actually read those IEPs. There are certain teachers, usually the really good ones, who have a lot of kids with IEPs in their classes, and they might not have thoroughly read everything. So if you find that, whatever is said in the IEP isn't really happening, please bring it to someone's attention. Sometimes teachers are just overwhelmed and have lost track of which thing they're doing for which child and so forth. And then you as a parent will receive information every time kids typically get their grades and so forth. You'll get a little narrative about each goal and the progress toward the goal, and whether they will be whether the child will be meeting that goal by the end of the IEP period, which is typically a year. It's a calendar year, not a school year. So if your IEP is written, today, May 21st, then it goes from May 21st this year to May 21st next year. It's a calendar year. The IEP is reviewed at least once a year, but it can be revised at any time. Parents have to be invited to these meetings. You can make suggestions as a parent. Teachers can make suggestions about IEP goals. You can agree or disagree and discuss what the goal is and so forth. At least every 3 years, a child has to be reevaluated to find out if they continue to be a child with a disability. So on those 3-year reevaluations, they will redo evaluation. They might do different ones. They might repeat other ones, and they will go down through that chart again, through that flow chart. If necessary, a child can be reevaluated beforehand, so before the 3-year reevaluation. And kids change and grow, and sometimes that happens. So if you find that oftentimes when students are presented with specialized education, they start to succeed in one way, and then that opens up another area that you didn't realize was a problem, and you can bring that to their attention, and another evaluation can be done for that. Okay. And what can we get? Okay, what we get on an IEP are specific goals, and they should be measurable and based on your child's present level or performance. If your child is in 7th grade and they're still working on adding and subtracting fractions with unlike denominators, that's the goal that we work on. If there is behavior that impacts learning, the IP can include behavior goals and a full behavior intervention plan. IEPs can address both academic and functional skills necessary for independence and daily living. It's not just about the academics. We don't just want them to pass their math class. We want them to have skills for future learning and living. Assistive technology can be added in there. If there are mental health issues, counseling can be added in there. And just keep in mind, it can be revised at any time if there's a need for changes. You don't have to wait for the annual review, just request an IEP meeting. Child's participation is very important. Sometimes parents don't disclose the evaluations to their children to protect them, that's fine. But to the extent possible, I think a child should participate in their ed plan and understand what they're struggling with and why they have goals, and they're usually more involved. But that's up to parents. The IEPs in Massachusetts include a transition plan to help them transition from school to post-school activities, whether that's a job or future learning or starting their own business. Starting at age 14, actually, the new IEP in Massachusetts puts extra emphasis on the transition planning and encourages students younger than 14 to participate, at least in the development of the IEP, if not attending the actual meeting. Many students think that, many kids would be kind of scared to be in a room full of their teachers and principal and all that, but if you can make that happen, that's helpful. All right, so what happens if you can't get what it is you need, or you signed an IEP, but it's not happening, or some other breakdown in communication is going on? We have a problem resolution system office in Everett, and they would be delighted to help you with that. First, of course, start with your teacher, principal, special education coordinator, or even your superintendent. But if you don't seem to be getting anywhere and people are not getting back to you or so forth, don't hesitate to contact this. This is part of our Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, and they are there to help you resolve these issues. So I want to just go through a few of the highlights of the revised forms, and I'm going to show you some goals and things, and then we'll wrap up and take any questions. So here's some highlights of the revised forms. Most of the schools should now all be using the revised forms. They were supposed to convert over in the 2024-2025 school year. But look, it's May, and I have to tell you, I have not seen very many of these forms yet. I may have seen maybe one or two out of the students that I work with. So I think schools are struggling to get these things underway. The forms are longer and more sort of spaced out and spread out. So there is some work being done there. The forms expand on the student and team vision by adding specific prompts. The old IEP form just said, what is your vision for the student? And it was kind of like, I don't know. What do you mean? What kind of a vision are we talking about here? So the new form adds really specific prompts, which is great. It adds space to describe not just the challenges, but also the student's strengths and interests and preferences. I have to tell you, this is huge. This is huge for teachers, for us teachers, and for administrators, because before we focused only on well, what is the student struggling with and what can we do about it? And now we know, well, what are they really good at? What are they interested in? How do they prefer having things done? And this is huge because there's so much more a teacher can do if they know that the student has an interest, and let's say this particular student is interested in sports. Well, that makes it so much easier for me to write math word problems, for example, that the student will actually look at and be interested in and so forth. So this is huge. Whoops. Okay, where are we going here? What else? It specifically requests information from parents and students to describe the students' present levels of achievement and functional performance. This used to be written only by the teachers or by the special ed teacher, and now parents and students get to chime in and say, well, I'm really good at this, but I'm not good at that, and this is what I'd like to do. It does break the achievements and functional performance into 4 separate areas: academics, behavioral, social, emotional, communication, and then additional like health, daily living, hearing, sensory, etc. Again, the old forms used to focus on the academics. Gradually, we added in behavioral and emotional things. Now we have, it's really broken down into these 4 separate areas, so they all get addressed. It expands on transition planning. The transition planning used to be half a page, now it's 2 pages. It separates accommodations from modifications and breaks these into 4 separate areas. What do they need in the classroom? What do they need outside of the classroom, like in the hallway, in gym class, in the cafeteria, waiting for the bus, etc. What about extracurricular activities? What about out into the community? As a student gets older, how do we connect them with supports out in the community, counseling or whatever they may need out in the community? All right, so here's a few bits from IEP forms that I've come across. Here's one: student and team vision. Here's the student: this year I want to learn, see how it's a specific prompt, more about division, she said. She was in 6th grade. She was in 6th grade. By the time I finish elementary or middle school, I want to read higher level books. When I'm in high school, I want to learn higher level math. After I finish high school, I'm not sure yet. After I finish high school, my employment plans are to find a job I am able to do. She's physically disabled. After I finish high school, my independent living plans are to work and someday be able to live independently. Okay, this is much more specific and tailored to the student. The next few slides, I think I'm going to share some goals. These goals are well written. They are very specific. They are measurable. You will see numbers in there, even though they're not math goals. There's even numbers in the ones that are not math goals. So I won't read them all. So we'll compare and contrast equivalent fractions, and we'll find equivalent fractions in order to add fractions with unlike denominators, and we'll simplify them as needed with 80% accuracy across 3 consecutive sessions. Boy, is that specific. Now the teacher knows exactly what to focus on, okay? If you don't write the goals, if you just write, the child will clean their room, that's not going to help anybody. We need to know how they're going to clean their room. What area are they going to clean? What steps are they going to go through? How are we going to know when it's clean? All these things are needed. Here's some reading goals. Given words in isolation and connected text, so-and-so will decode single and multisyllabic words containing a variety of syllable types with consonant and vowel suffixes with 80% accuracy and independence. Okay, again, these are good goals that I've gleaned from really good, well-written IEPs. Writing goals. So given in direct instruction and practice, so-and-so will fill in a graphic organizer with relevant information and details and then use it to produce a composition with 80% independence in 4 out of 5 observed opportunities. Very nicely specific and measurable. Executive function. Here's a couple. Will independently manage personal belongings, schedules, learning materials, etc., using an appropriate tool, crossbody backpack, with appropriate weight, with no more than 2 teacher prompts. Okay. All right. So let's wrap up. We are just about at the end. Oh, yes, the resources. Okay. So I have a few resources for you. Of course, you can, put in your search engine IEPs and so forth, but you won't get a lot that is specific to Massachusetts. So first stop is the Department of Education in Massachusetts. Another really helpful one is this Parent Coalition. That's also Massachusetts based. I think they've expanded, but they are based in Massachusetts. And then we also have a parent advocacy group, which is a great resource. And if you are thinking of hiring an advocate to help you, that's a pretty good resource. And okay, we are just about done. And do we have any questions? I'm just looking at my notes to see if I missed anything. Okay, fabulous. And that's my email and contact information. Don't hesitate to shoot me a quick email if you have a question or if something I said doesn't make sense or if I didn't explain it well enough. I am happy to respond to emails. And I wanted to mention that I prepared a PDF version of these slides. So if you're interested in that, you might want to contact Stacy and ask her for a copy. Especially, I think I think it would be especially useful if the last few slides with those benchmarks, those goals and benchmarks on them. I have seen over the years a number of IEPs that are vague, let's say, enough so that it really does not help the child because the teacher looks at that and reads that and doesn't know specifically what they need to do. Whereas the ones that, some of the ones that I showed you, when they're written that way, it's very, very specific and it makes it much easier for teachers to follow through on that. And um, and then it makes it easier for you as parents to understand what exactly it is that teachers are looking for the progress that you want your child to make to the next level.
Hi, I have a question.
Sure.
Yes, I am Virginie Kamwene. I'm very grateful to be here with this training. I am here as a parent of a child, lifelong IEP, nonverbal autistic, and I'm also a provider. I'm a clinician and a outpatient and ABA therapist that works with a lot of parents, especially minority underserved, and I'm down to North Andover. My question is, with the new IEP, I come across a lot of families.
Yeah.
First of all, doesn't have an education on an IEP or a 504. So I have parent group. We do IEP training, clinic through my experience from the LAND program. Um, the question is coming lately, which is the new IEP. Them themselves, the parent asking themselves a question saying, what exactly they may pay attention to see on the new IEP. For me, I have my son. I'm involved on his IP. I know
Mhm.
exactly what I'm looking for, the goals, the transition. He used an assisted device, all that. But
Right.
other parents asking this question, they don't have a good understanding of that a new IP, what the difference, and what exactly they might be paying attention for.
Right. Yeah, that's a very good question, Virginie. And thank you for providing the services that you provide. We are seriously short of ABA practitioners, and there is a great need for that, especially for younger kids, but also for older kids who were overlooked and didn't get that help at the time when they needed it. Um, so, the new IEP, let's face it, it's twice as long as it was before. And that is not by accident. They didn't make it longer to make it harder for people, but it is overwhelming. The old IEP was very condensed and just made a long list of accommodations, and they were often, well, you know what happens when you read a long list of something, you can't remember the whole list. It's humanly impossible to remember. Some teachers look at that and they just, they can't focus on it. And they don't know. That's why I was saying, when you see the IEP, make sure you read it, because teachers sometimes don't have a chance to read it. Some teachers have, 5 and 6 and 7 kids with IEPs in their classroom. So the old IEP just had this sort of, I don't know, laundry list. And it was hard for teachers to read it. It was hard for parents to read it. I understand that too. So the new IEP breaks that up and says, no, we're not going to talk about just a list of accommodations. We're going to say, in the classroom, what does the student need? What are the accommodations they need? And what are the modifications they need? So that's one area to look at. And, it is a longer piece, but it's also spaced out a little more so that you can really look at it. And, the other area that I would look at, the first area actually that I would look at, is that vision statement. The more information you can put in there, the more helpful it is to teachers. Because as I was saying, teachers have to individualize on an IEP. And if you don't know much about that individual, for example, Virginie, what does your son like to do? What are his interests? Is he like basketball? Does he like puzzles? Does he like, what are his interests? And I can, as a teacher, I can take that information and modify those materials nicely to fit him and to interest him, because that's what an IEP is for. So really pay attention to that vision statement and where you want things to go. Pay attention to that page that talks about their interests and their preferences. Teachers, if they don't have that information, will make assumptions and may or may not be right about what happens. The other part to pay attention to carefully would be those goals and those benchmarks, those last handful of slides that I was showing you. Make sure that those are very specific, not, the child will do better adding fractions or something like that. No, I want to know exactly what kind of fractions, what kind of reading, what level reading. You want them reading multisyllable words. How many books do you expect him to read? How many chances are you going to give him to get this answer right? Is he going to have to infer or use, answer specific comprehension questions? All of those things really need to be very, very, very specific. And through no fault of their own, school districts just write it as quickly, or they write it the way they've always written it. And, we need to hold them to account and have them write it properly. And in the end, it helps everyone, because when it's written properly like that, it's understandable. It's written in plain speak. And if it needs to be translated into another language, if it's very specific, that's easier to translate into another language that parents can easily understand. And it's easier for teachers to follow. They know exactly what to do. Okay, so I know it's overwhelming, but those are my recommendations. The area where you're looking at the vision, the area where you're putting in the preferences, and then look very carefully at those goals and benchmarks and make sure they're specifically written.
Thank you very much. That was a great explanation. But even you're right, like my son, we just find his preference through the new IEP. We never knew what he liked. His vision, how he said it through the device, it was incredible. So
Yes,
thank you so much for that. Yeah.
you are very welcome.
I don't see any other questions, Kat or Stacy.
Okay, no problem.